Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Section 2 of his Enquiry Concerning the Human Understanding, David Hume brings up an interesting thought experiment about colors and the ideas that we have in our mind and our capacity, a productive capacity of our imagination to supply what sensation would not have had. And before we launch into examining that example that he provides and considering what its implications are, we should think about the general principle that he's trying to use this to illustrate. So this is in his discussion about where our ideas come from. They come from our impressions originally, certainly the ones that have to do with sense do so, but also those that stem from, you could say, our passions, our internal states. So he says that if it happened from a defect of the organ that a person is not susceptible of any species of sensation, any type of sensation, we always find that they're as little susceptible to the correspondent idea. Because remember, ideas, other than the ones that we compound and compose through the imagination, are copies of our original impressions or perceptions through the senses or through our passions. So he says, a blind person, for example, can form no notion of colors, a deaf person none of sounds. But restore to either of them the sense in which they're deficient by opening this new inlet for their sensations. You also open an inlet for the ideas, and then they find no difficulty in conceiving these objects, the whole range of that sense. He says that it's similar with particular objects. The case is the same if the object proper for exciting any sensation has never been applied to the organ. A Laplander, a person in the high north in Finland, or an African has no notion of the relish of wine. Now, of course, Hume is a little bit off base when it comes to that. And he says, although there are few or no instances of a like deficiency of the mind when a person has never felt or is wholly incapable of a sentiment or passion that belongs to the species, we find the same observation to take place in a less degree. So a man of mild manners can form no idea, no effective idea of inveterate revenge or cruelty, right? He lacks the original passion that then could give rise to the idea in their mind. Nor can a selfish heart easily conceive the heights of friendship and generosity. They can know the word, they can have a really vague concept that people think this is important, but they can't actually do anything with it. And another great example of this, people who don't feel fear. One person who is a particularly aggressive man, when shown pictures of people showing fear on their face, he said, "That's the face people make before I hurt them." He couldn't conceive of what fear was actually like. Interestingly, some of those people who in most cases don't feel fear have been shown by some experiments to have the possibility of having it induced by subjecting them to near drowning. And in that case, it winds up being almost unmanageable. So going on with this, he says that it's readily allowed other beings may possess many senses of which we can have no conception, because the ideas of them have never been introduced to us in the only manner by which an idea can have access to the mind, that is, by the actual feeling and sensation. So what is the general rule here? If we don't have a sense perception, an impression of it, or a impression by having a passion or sentiment, then we can't have the corresponding idea. Now, Hume says that's usually the case, but we can imagine a case where things turn out differently. And here's where we get this very interesting exception about the missing shade of blue. He says that, I believe it will readily be allowed that the several distinct ideas of color, which enter by the eye, or the sound, which are conveyed by the ear, are really different from each other, though at the same time resembling each other. So what does he mean there? Different shades of, for example, like the white on the chalkboard, right? If you were to look at these chalk marks very carefully, or the gray of the chalkboard, you would notice that they're different from each other. If you blew it up in an image, you could look at the pixels, and you could like pick out each one as having a different color profile, right? So he says that if this is true of different colors, it must be no less so of the different shades of the same color. So Hume is going to consider blue. Why blue? It's a nice primary color, easy to see contrast with. You don't have the problem of red-green color blindness or any of that sort of stuff. So we've got blue. Now, think to yourself of your own experiences with all the different shades of blue, right? Imagine that like you're going to the hardware store and picking out some paint with those color pattern strips that you can see, and they've got all the different shades. So Hume says, let's imagine to ourselves that we have a person who has enjoyed his sight for 30 years. And as Hume says, he is perfectly acquainted with all the different shades of blue except for one, which this person has never come across. Now, perfectly acquainted means that they've had many experiences of these shades of blue. They've got plenty of impressions. Those impressions have given rise to ideas. Let's even go a little bit further than Hume and say this person has, a really good memory, and they can lay out all these different shades in relation to each other. So he says, let all the different shades of that color, except that single one, be placed in front of this person, descending gradually from the deepest, the darkest, almost black, to the lightest. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Hume says this person is actually going to perceive a blank in the place where that missing shade ought to be. That seems rather dubious. If we understand it in terms of literally a blank spot, because we've got these color tiles all laid out in relation to each other, but the person could spread them apart from each other and say, there's something missing here. I think that's more or less what Hume has in mind when he says perceives a blank. He perceives that there's something missing there. How? Because he's sensible of the greater contrast between the two blues between which this missing shade of blue ought to be. So he's sensible of a lack of a shade of blue that should be right in between those two. How is he sensible of that? Well, he's looking at this entire gradation, and he sees that something is not right. Something is missing. There's more of a leap from one discrete blue to the next discrete blue. Now here's where it gets important from a Humean perspective. Up until this point, it's just kind of an interesting, coincidence. And we can replicate this with other things, right? Tastes, sounds, odors, all sorts of other things as well, right? Touch, perhaps. A person has never experienced a certain type of heat, right? Can that person, through the force of their imagination, this power that we have, he says, would it be possible for that person, from their own imagination, to supply this deficiency and raise up to himself the idea of that particular shade, though it had never been conveyed to him by his senses? Then Hume says, I think that everyone would agree, or there are few but will be of the opinion, that he can. And now, what is the implication of this? Hume says, this is a proof that the simple ideas are not in every instance derived from the correspondent impressions. So it's possible that the general rule that Hume lays out, that all of our ideas of the mind are derived from the impressions we originally have, it's possible that there are important exceptions to that. But how important are these exceptions? They're actually not that important. Hume says, this serves as a proof that simple ideas are not always derived from it, though this instance is so singular that it is scarcely worth our observing. You might say, well, why did you observe it then, Hume? And does not merit that for it alone we should alter our general maxim. We can say that our general maxim is, in general, correct. Our ideas are derived from our impressions. But there is the possibility that in rare cases, where a person already has a very well-developed set of sensory experiences to work with, they can use their productive faculty of imagination to supply what is missing. Notice that this has to be something that actually is missing. This is not about imagining a shade of blue that's not within the blue spectrum. Some new shade of blue that doesn't exist. Instead, it has to do with one that we know is missing for this person. And we can say the same thing about flavors, A person tries out a bunch of different spicy peppers, and they've got a really spicy one here and a mildly spicy one here, and that's all they've ever tasted, and then they've tasted bland things and they've tasted super spicy things. They could supply the, kind of in the middle taste. Or think about beers, right? The bitterness of hops. You could well imagine to yourself what a hop in between this one and this one is like, can't you? Or in terms of sweetness or things like that. But you have to have a frame of reference already well developed in order to make this work. And we could also say, how do we actually know that that person has in their mind the corresponding idea? It's not like we can carve their head open and look inside and see the missing shade of blue. So that is what's going on with this interesting exception about the missing and then supplied through the imagination shade of blue.